Well, another federal council. It's terrific to see you all again, and sadly I only see some of you at this anniversary when it comes around to our federal conference. I was thinking though, as we ponder where we're up to in life, this is an election year and we're coming up to an election. I was just thinking how long it has been since we've been in opposition and we've been having these federal councils, and it really isn't very long at all. If someone was born in November of 2007, a young girl, she would be six. She'd be looking forward to her 6th birthday in November this year. It doesn't seem very long, but my, how her world has changed. How her world has changed. Who would have thought? Who would have thought that back in 2007 that you would have possibly guessed that we'd have a debt of $300 billion? Who would have possibly guessed? I mean, her parents wouldn't have thought about that. They voted in the Labor Party, it was all going well. Remember, in the year of her birth, there was no debt. There was none. None at all. We weren't thinking about whether it was 34 million a day or 35 million a day we were paying in interest, arguing whether it was 100 million a day we borrowed or 95 million a day we borrowed. We just didn't have any debt. And who would have thought in the year of her birth that we actually had a surplus? Now, of course, she wouldn't understand what a surplus was, even if you described it to her, because there's no such thing since in her world. But in the year of her birth, of course, we had a $19.8 billion debt, and that's a surplus. And the same sort of numbers seem to have turned around. But it's certainly a very, very different world that she can remember. I really couldn't conceive in 2007 that 6 years later we'd have a carbon tax, a tax and representing regional rural Australia that has just done so much damage to our competitiveness and has effectively really hasn't helped the environment. We all know that. It's completely counterintuitive, and we just would never have guessed that our nation would have gone what I consider in completely the wrong direction so quickly. The same can be said about a mining tax. We would never have dreamed we're suddenly going to tax the business of mining, who have provided very much of a shot in the arm to our economy at a very important time internationally. And of course, on her birthday, she could have got out of bed in the morning on her birthday and her parents said, "How you going, love?" And it's all right. And the old fella's reading the newspaper. There wouldn't have been anything about boats in the front page because there wasn't any. No boats. 6 years ago, there was not a single boat arriving in this nation. How quickly that has changed. I think this year we've blown out the arrivals by some 22,000 people. And they're the ones who arrived. They're the ones who arrived. A very, very sad state of affairs. And who would have thought back in 2007 that the Queensland government, the new Campbell government, would be rescuing the Aboriginal people from the Cape from Labor legislation that said, I'm sorry, you can't possibly contemplate mining on your land. You can't continue to drive cattle on your country and make money out of that. Effectively, there was governments in Queensland and federally who thought that Aboriginal people should simply stand on one leg with the sun setting over the left shoulder with the pandanus in the photograph shop, some part of a museum. We would never have thought that back then. And I must commend Campbell Newman for his efforts in that area. Marine protected areas. The rollout of marine protected areas since 2007, we've now know so much more about this completely failed policy. Instead of rolling out benefits to the environment, because there was no sophistication, it was poorly motivated. It wasn't motivated to look after the environment. It was in fact motivated to look after the Labor Party by ensuring that they did a preference deal with the Greens. And motivation is the important thing. Because on any enterprise, if you're not motivated by the right thing, invariably you won't go to where that motivation took you. And that's why there have been such a fundamental failure, because of displaced effort, serial overfishing in areas that should not have occurred. I certainly would never have guessed that that would have been the case in 2007. The live cattle trade. Iconic cattle industry. Who would have thought Aboriginal people drifting along behind cattle on a horse, men and women charging around on horses, trucks going up and down the highway, live cattle ships coming in and out of Darwin and the northern ports. It was all part of our life, a substantive part of the enterprise of the North. Who would think in 2007 that today it would be an industry crippled by the decisions of a corrupt government, a government corrupted by self-interest, a government corrupted by their need for power. They will do anything to get that power. They were happy to trade away the lives and the future of Aboriginal people in the Cape. They were happy to trade away the lives and future of people in a very, very important cattle industry of North Australia. They were happy to trade those away for their vested interest in preferences for the Greens. We were exporting animal welfare. We were doing a fantastic job in 2007. We were improving the slaughtering processes through Indonesia and to a lesser degree in the Philippines. But it was our industry that was exporting the very best practices in very difficult circumstances across the globe. That was halted. Of course, if you are motivated, if you're not motivated by the right outcomes, then that's what happens. And sadly, that's now left over 4,000 cattle that remain here. We're now seeing photos on the front page of The Australian about small drought. It's not only about the drought, it's about the huge numbers of animals who have been left without fodder and without grass. And of course, the organisations that assisted with that are to be held to account. So when somebody said to me, Nigel, are you coming along on the 1,000 Paws Walk to support the RSPCA? I said, look, I do not support those who are the enemies of my friends. And I think it's something we should all think about. I was a great supporter of RSPCA. I do not support them in any of their iterations now. They have destroyed families, Australian communities and Australian individuals. Their part they play in that cannot be spun around by asking me to pat the head of a plastic dog. This is Labor's legacy. It's a legacy of shame, a legacy of intergenerational debt. I'm a simple man, simple conservative values, the values of my parents, and I'm very pleased to be amongst my colleagues who share those same conservative values. And the fundamental value for me in any role is we've got to leave the world a better place than where we stood into it. It's a very simple process. And I think the legacy that Labor have left that 6-year-old is a legacy that includes possibly intergenerational debt for years under which her children and her grandchildren are likely to be paying off. Look, I've touched on some of the values of our Nationals and some of the values that make up our character. It's one of the great things about being a Nat. I think certainly all my colleagues, directly my parliamentary colleagues, and many of you who belong to the National Party that I know, are very grassroots people. Wherever you're with my colleagues, they know people, they're a pretty knockabout sort of crowd, very, very connected with their communities. And I'd like to talk briefly about my portfolio and make some observations about why Aboriginal people have so much in common with this party. The things that frustrate you, the things that frustrate me, often frustrate the local Aboriginal constituents. I was in Timber Creek on Wednesday. I flew down from in between estimates. We flew down up to Darwin, down to Timber Creek, and I fronted the Northern Land Council. And one particular interesting part, Warren Snowden had come in, flew in, and had a couple of things to say. And then he had some questions, and one of the questions was something about health. I can't really remember, a question about a health centre, and he answered, "We've got money. We've got plenty of money. Don't worry about the money." And it was just so heartening to see the whole 85 traditional owners that make up, just the open antagonism and the catcalls of, "It's not your money, mate." And where are you going to borrow that from? People getting up and walking out. So there is no difference in the frustration we feel to the frustration are the people, the Aboriginal people who reside in many of our electorates, and I think there's a great deal of what's affecting them that is affecting us. As Wacker just touched on, and I can't take too much of the credit for that, but we'll note in the Northern Territory, it was the Aboriginal people of the Northern Territory that swept the CLP to power. Nothing less. Nothing less. And the reason that they were swept to power was that they believed that they had been taken for granted. They had been taken for granted by the Labor Party for a very long time. Now, I don't think they're going to be taken for granted again, and that's a lesson to all of us. Even as Conservatives, they have come to our side, and I think we really need to be listening very carefully to that demographic. In most electorates, you'll find, and people say, well, they're very small numbers. You say, well, 1.8, 2% of the electorate, marginal electorate, that's an awful lot. And they certainly conventionally have voted for the Labor Party, but I suspect there is going to be a seismic shift. I was right in my predictions about the Northern Territory election because of those shifts, and I can tell you as I move around Australia, Aboriginal people are sick and tired of the way that they have been treated by this government and several Labor governments in the states and territories. So over the years, Aboriginal people, through land rights and native title, have acquired land and let their land back. And they now face exactly the same issues, whether it's the wild rivers where they say you can have your land back, mate, no drama, but as long as you don't use it. So these same, exactly the same issues in the wild rivers as our Native Vegetation Act, whether you're grazing in the high country, they all resonate very strongly with the policies and the issues facing Conservatives and particularly the National Party. The other week I was actually with Maurice Payne and I visited Darubbin, local land council in New South Wales. Now I've over time become very closely associated with the land council in New South Wales, and whilst many of you wouldn't know about that, we do all know about how hard it is to get paid up members. They have 22,000. 22,000 people are members of the New South Wales Land Council. Very professional. And it may surprise you, in my view, very conservative mob. So I was in Darubbin and I was in Penrith actually, and the Darubbin Land Council, we were talking to them about what the challenges that were facing them. And they said, well, we've just been handed all this land back, we fought for years, it's quite a considerable amount of land, it could have been quite valuable to them in terms of building and development and creating jobs and opportunities for their people and the owners of the land. Now this is land that had been stripped of its topsoil, it had gravel pits on it, had sand mines, it had been pretty significantly turned over. But as soon as it was issued, the local council, some conservation groups, had decided that that would be much better as a park or conservancy area, and it's all part of the creation of a corridor. So this would say extremely altered landscapes. They can't even use that. They can't even use that. And I would say to Victor Domelello, thanks very much. You are starting to actually turn the corner about communicating and sitting down and talking with these Aboriginal groups about what can be done to change some of these conventions of the past. Of course, we still have communities that don't have a lot of access to land. Invariably, you'll have heard me and you'll heard them on the news talking of communities perhaps in Northern Territory or far Western Australia. Perhaps I can talk briefly about somewhere that's close to the hand, at Toomela, and it's Mark Colton knows it very well, and he's taken me there a number of times. A few kilometres from Boggabilla, just over the road from Gundy, over the river. Some of you will have been there, many of you will have heard about it. The various governments turn up and say, look, these are the problems, we invariably throw money, new programs, it's just a cycle of life. And it's just like this rut. They do exactly the same thing year in, year out, year in, year out. So I was saying, an old mate of mine said to me, he said, look, there's only one difference between a rut and a grave, is one's got ends on it. And I can tell you, as far as some of these communities, that's the way you have to see it. And the fundamental problem is it's where it is. It's not there for any particular economic reason, or there's not because it's on a major highway and there's opportunities for tourism. Let's be honest, if you think about it, the inhabitants of Toomela, they didn't set up Toomela. It was the creation of government. Government said, well, where are we going to put these people? You rounded them all up, like many parts of the country, and we put them in a place that had the least economic value, the least economic potential, and that's why they live where they live. We've got some mission managers in charge, and the residents were usually a source of casual labour and important labour. Now, that's history, and I'm not really reflecting on that, on Australia's history. But when you say to them, listen, perhaps we can move away from Toomela, we might move somewhere closer to a job, they say, and rightly so, look, well, this is my home. This is my home. And so we forget about that and we continue to try to manage this nightmare by a whole range of different processes. But what we must start saying, we must start thinking outside of the square. So instead of saying, let's be honest and fair income with them and engage with the community and say, well, look, instead of building a new public housing here, why don't we move some more, we'll build your next piece of public housing close to a job, close to a better school, close to a higher level of health amenity. Because if we don't, this rut will become a grave. And this is all about making sure that we engage honestly and openly with these communities. And these communities, of course, in many of the electorates. We've got Cherbourg in Warren Truss's electorate, Warrambinda in Kenny O'Dowd's electorate. And these are the sort of places that we all know about, and yet the policies are designed just to somehow, we can say we've been doing something, and yet we know in our heart of hearts that what we're doing simply isn't enough. And so we all, as a community and as a nation, are duty bound to start stepping outside of the political comfortable area and start a discussion about what we're going to do about these communities, how can we help them, and how can we engage them in that very serious debate. So places like Ceduna, where social problems dominate the scene, make life pretty miserable for everybody, including the majority of Aboriginal citizens, and like everyone else, they deplore the behaviour often of a few. So we have a very important task of brokering a better outcome for all by involving Aboriginal people in pursuit of these solutions. They have to be at the centre of the debate and the centre of the solutions. So Rowan Ramsey and myself will be travelling to Ceduna and Cooper Pedy, and we'll talk about income management and family responsibility commission. And it's interesting, they want to talk about these things because they work. Interestingly, there were a collaboration between the Cape York, Melbourne Cape York, and the John Howard government. And so, these are things that worked in the past because they came from a collaborative process. Most public servants continue to promise some economic nirvana around the corner, just as long as you sign up to this compulsory plan of planning, and it goes on and on. It's rubbish. And we should no longer stick to this mantra of doing the same thing time and time again and thinking that something different is going to happen. But it has changed. It is changing rapidly. In a few weeks' time, Barnaby and myself, I'm going to visit Barnaby in his what we will hope to be his new electorate. I'm looking forward to that. Got a three-day road trip around New England. We will meet, and I will visit every local land council, every dedicated medical service. We'll meet many of the Aboriginal people who live there. Now, of course, it's so hard to do. How would you possibly have done that 6 years ago? Well, we're actually being hosted by the Land Council. So we have we have one of the most respected elders, Tom Briggs from the New South Wales Land Council. He's going to guide us. He's my mate. He's doing all the introductions. Who would have thought this would have happened 6 years ago? Who would have thought this would possibly have happened? So as for our 6-year-old and her parents, they would know very much the importance of this election. I think it is our responsibility, absolutely, to change the legacy of Labor. We need to provide a bright, shining future and full of opportunities for her and her mates. So it is the responsibilities of the Nationals to provide that brighter and stronger future. Thank you.